Good morning and welcome. Thank you for registering and attending our fourth webinar delivered during the coronavirus pandemic. It's 10 a.m. and it's Wednesday, the 27th of May. From the 4th of July, as we start to reopen hospitality in the UK, have we thought about everything? Are we ready? Are our guests ready? My name is Jane Pendlebury. I am the CEO of HOSPA, the Hospitality Professionals Association. I'm joined today by Ben Pask from Rare Consulting, who has previously presented research at Hospace, and Steve Lowy, who many of you will know from his various guises, not least as a previous chairman of the Hotel Marketing Association. We have a loose agenda for today. We will start with Ben presenting his data, followed by a discussion between Ben and with Steve. We will then move swiftly on to answer questions from the audience. Please use the question tab on your GoToWebinar app, and I will direct as many of those questions as I can to the speakers. Thank you for joining us. I do hope the next hour will be beneficial to you all. Let me start by introducing and asking Ben to introduce himself and then passing on to Steve.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everybody. My name's Ben. I run Rare Consulting. We are a research and digital product development company. Over the past 8 weeks, we've been tracking, actually 10 weeks thinking about it, we've been tracking how consumers have been responding to the pandemic across many different categories. So today I'll be talking to you a little bit about the research we've done to date and some of those key findings. Over to you, Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Lowy. I'm CEO of Anglo Educational Services. We operate 250 service departments in central London and provide educational opportunities for American students, mainly in London. We also have a luxury brand called The Residence, which is more for the corporate market, with 4 locations, one which went live last week and one going live next week. A little challenging. But also was a founder of Umi Digital, which is a digital marketing agency aimed at the hotel and travel sector, and sit on a number of boards, including HMA and BETA, which is the British Educational Travel Association. Thank you. I guess over to you, Ben.
Yeah, grand. Shall I kick off? Grand. So hopefully you'll all be able to see some slides. It should be pink in colour. If you can't see them, just give us a shout and we can see if we can sort that out for you. So over the last 10 weeks at Rare, we've been looking at how different markets have been changing with the pandemic and how consumers have been behaving as well. It's been a really fascinating 10 weeks to see how things have evolved over that time. In terms of the research that we've put in market, we've looked at there's 3 things that we're doing concurrently. So we've got a consumer tracker where we're looking at how they're engaging with different categories. So that's looking at retail, exercise, beauty, hospitality, travel, lots of different sectors. Obviously, we had it was very quiet in the hospitality sector, but what we are seeing is some evidence of people really being keen to get back to be able to travel and experiencing things. So we've had our consumer tracker, but we've also been measuring brand reputation as well. So looking at how well or not so well different brands have been responding to the pandemic from the point of view of the UK consumers. So we're looking at different categories. Again, it's super fascinating to see how different sectors are performing compared to other ones. And alongside this, we've also been running diary studies where we get different households to take part and document each day of a week how their habits are changing with regard to a certain sector. So we've looked at entertainment, finance, and other categories to just understand, well, what's the richness behind the patterns we're seeing with that macro data. I'll do my best not to bore you all with loads of stats. I will try and keep it relatively interesting. Do my best. But in terms of the broad themes, it's really difficult. One of the questions we often get asked is, what behaviours can we predict in the future? And it's really quite challenging from a research perspective to understand that. What we have done over the past few weeks is to try and identify what is it that people are looking forward to the most. So if they could imagine when the lockdown restrictions have been lifted, then what are they looking forward to doing? And it's really interesting to look at the data, because what we've seen over the last 3 weeks is consistently People are interested in spending time with their family, their friends. They want to see things. They want to meet people. It's very steeped in this kind of notion that people want to experience things, you know, have a sensory experience, have an emotional experience with somebody. And that comes out across the last 3 weeks. For consumer categories, what we've seen is that there hasn't necessarily been much movement with things such as, you know, retail, you know, kind of the categories associated with discretionary spend in that respect. However, one category that we are measuring that's doing well is actually travel. So we've seen in the past 3 weeks that intention to travel, or the extent to which people have mentioned they are looking forward to travel, has increased from 4% to 8% in the last 3 weeks, and becoming one of the highest ranked things that people are looking forward to. So we know that they're looking forward to seeing their family, being able to reconnect with friends, and to travel. Looking at how people are feeling is also really important, and this is relevant to every sector. You know, to really keep tabs on this over time. You can see on that trend line that we've seen levels of worry in the UK peak around the week commencing 13th of April, and has started to subside to some extent. That feeling of worry has been replaced by, in quite an interesting paradox, a feeling of content. So you've got a good proportion of people at the moment who say, actually, I feel quite happy with things. I don't really want to go back to how things were before. And in particular, we've seen, if you look at the different regions, it tends to be people who live in rural areas in the southeast, and younger generations are more likely to feel content at the moment compared to others. And the other upwards shift we've seen in the market is the level of restlessness. Now, looking at this data in particular, this is up to last weekend. Obviously, this weekend there were some interesting events in the news, which of course will have an impact on people's perception of, you know, how they're feeling at the moment. So that, I think that's going to be quite interesting to observe how that changes behaviour. So overall, people are, compared to other categories, we are seeing that appetite for travel is one that sees most kind of engagement and future intention at the moment. We know the UK is split in terms of, you know, you've got the overriding sense of worry, but it's not the case for everybody. Some people are actually quite content with the situation. Other people are just can't wait to get back into work or get back into normal life. When you ask people, you know, where would they be interested in traveling? You know, what if you're telling us, yes, I'm curious about traveling in the future, where is it you're likely to want to go? We're seeing this quite interesting split with intention to travel. So you've got 24% of people in the UK saying they would consider going internationally only, and you've got a good proportion there, 42% of people saying, I'm just going to stay in the UK. If you split that down in terms of the different demographics, you see quite an interesting pattern, which is that looking at those who are willing to travel internationally generally have more of a youth skew to the data, less likely to be an older demographic that's going to agree to that. And emotionally as well, looking across the 3 key top emotions that we've been able to capture and derive any meaning with the stats here, we're seeing quite a difference. So people who are, you know, more inclined to say, I would like to travel in the UK, are more likely to feel content compared to those who would be more willing to travel overseas. And interestingly as well, although the base size is too small to say with any degree of certainty, there's an indication that people who are willing to travel internationally also have a high level of sadness and anger. So, you know, why is this sort of stuff important? Well, it's really important for lots of different aspects, whether that be comms, customer service, also just the simple ability to understand what are the primary concerns of people that are staying in around your destination or in your space. Is that, you know, we have to be quite wary of how people are likely to respond to changes in the environment. When you also look in the UK to understand, all right, so for those that are considering traveling in the UK, and split that out by different regions, you've got the demographics up here at the top, then you've got the destinations there on the left. And there's some interesting, quite kind of habitual patterns that are occurring where people are more inclined to stay within regions they're comfortable with. So if you look at, for example, the West Midlands, I grew up there, so know the holidays are very similar every year in the 80s. You know, you'd probably go somewhere quite local or into Wales or the Southwest. That's quite a kind of common holiday that we go on as a family. And you can see, certainly looking at Scotland in particular, 77% of people in Scotland saying actually they don't fancy crossing the border going into England. They're blown already at this particular point. So it's interesting to see for those in the UK where they're willing to travel is very much, you know, in their destination. Now
I can see 7% of people from London are willing to go to the northeast. So that's about 200 miles, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, I see where you're going with this one. Yeah, particularly if you live in Islington. Yeah. Might help if you've got a second home. And it's interesting to look at the types of accommodation that people are also interested in staying. So I think this is fascinating, really. I think it's worth us having a conversation around this. So if you ask people what type of accommodation they'd be willing to stay in whilst they're going on holiday, 39%. So it's not the majority, but it's certainly the largest share of intention is for people staying in hotels. Then you've got holiday cottages, second homes, bed and breakfasts. And I think if you were to overlay on top of this a measure to which you've got sort of isolated social contact or, you know, social contact that is maybe potentially a little bit more chaotic. So you'd probably see quite a simple pattern there. It's interesting, I think, for a lot of people in the hospitality industry to look at the score of Airbnb. So, Steve, I think we were talking about this yesterday. It'd be worth,
I think a lot of it will be, all accommodation providers is trust. I think a lot of the big brands have come out with some very detailed cleaning charters and procedures, and you know, a lot of brand partnerships with different, you know, obviously Domestos maybe not after Trump's little faux pas a few weeks ago, but the reality is, and we've done it with our apartments, you know, we have in-house customers and big corporates staying with us in our luxury brand, and we've sent them out a cleaning charge because we want to start cleaning those flats properly, and they've been really happy to it. I think we need to be not so British about it and really try and share that, whether you're an independent hotel, a holiday cottage, a resort. I think people will want that, and I think the trust within the sector is going to be really, really important. I think, as you showed earlier, the difference between rural and coastal and city centre is going to be very interesting in terms of where people want to travel within their space. But as it can be seen in terms of destinations, people won't want to travel too far. So from a marketing perspective, I think one of the things people have talked about is the new norm. And I think once hotels reopen, wherever they are, the initial customer base may be different to what they've had before. So therefore your marketing needs to be slightly different. More geo-targeted marketing, making sure your Google Maps profile is, your business profile is up to date with what's open and what's not. It's going to be a lot about truth and transparency. Again, something the government hasn't done so well, but you don't want people to have more fear than they need once they get to that hotel and making that decision beforehand. As it shows by the looks of the sentiment, people are going to travel probably no more than 100 miles to a holiday initially, again with social media and with AdWords through Google and other platforms. You can target people within 100 miles of your hotel or your apartment. So I think it's going to be very much choosing that. Also, which has been the case through recessions and terrorist attacks and so forth, youth travellers under 35 tend to be the ones that travel first. With this, it may be under 40s. If you look at stats, sadly, obviously, having daily death stats, people become slightly numb towards it. But I think in England, 40 people under the age of 40 have passed away due to COVID-19 out of 30,000. So in theory, they may feel, you know, although there may be more anxiety in some cases, there also may be more demand in terms of people doing that. So even a more luxurious hotel, some of those people may actually want to to go travelling and go for a weekend trip, or midweek if they're furloughed potentially. So I think people are going to really need to look at their marketing personas of their customers, and it's going to have to change as people become less anxious through the period. So if you look at Spain, they started opening outdoor restaurants 3 weeks ago. They're now getting busier. Received an email from a hotel on the south coast in Spain that said they're opening on the 2nd of July. This is the procedures that they're going to go through to make it comfortable for everyone. And they showed great excitement about opening. I think the other point, which we discussed yesterday, was very much about the industry helping the industry get out of it. So I think that is something that will be really interesting. I for one, have booked a trip to the Cotswolds in the middle of July. It was a trip that I planned for April. It was cancelled. I emailed the hotel. We were equally excited about rebooking and for my wife and I to having both been working from home together for 11 weeks to just go somewhere different. And I'm really excited about it. I completely trust the hotel. And I think hoteliers sharing those stories are going to be really important, whether it's hoteliers, restaurateurs, pub owners. I think the industry has been really good at getting in, trying to get stuff done through government together. And I think we're all going to have to work together to get out of it, because ultimately it's going to be trust, and anxiety is often caused by fear or distrust of something around you. And I think that's something that needs to be corrected. For Airbnb style accommodation, I think you've got to split that into professional managed Airbnb style accommodation, so service apartments and so forth, and the spare room in someone's house. I think that's going to take a long time for people to get trust in, because quite frankly, a lot of people at home won't have access to the same cleaning products that professional service providers will have. Hostels, and my first job within accommodation was running a backpackers hostel with 500 beds and dorms for up to 12 people. It's going to be a challenge, quite frankly. A lot of hostels depend on school groups. That was one of the first markets to ban travel. It started in France in February, that they stopped all international school trips. And that will require great adaptation of what the normal procedures are. On the contrary, individual backpackers may be willing to travel, but it won't be at the volume that they probably had before. So I think that will be a challenge. So yeah, I don't know.
I just want to pick up on something you mentioned there, just this notion of trust. So we've been looking across different sectors and measuring each week the extent to which people agree with the statement that a business has responded good or bad to the pandemic. And we're also measuring the extent to which they trust that particular brand, and it correlates almost perfectly across every category. And we've seen real fluctuations week by week where bigger brands, like for example, TK Maxx, right, it's not in the sector, it's in a different sector, of course. But when it was announced by I can't remember the union, investigated their practices with staff care, went into a warehouse and found that staff weren't able to exercise social distancing. There's always accusations about their lack of care for their employees. You can just see the data just dips, just goes all the way down. And it's been really difficult for lots of businesses, particularly larger businesses, to maintain the perception. In fact, they're having to almost kind of overexert their usual PR efforts to be seen to be doing something quite positive. In travel, so when we looked at airlines in particular, it's interesting to see there's an element to which kind of corporate attitudes towards employees have been detrimental to the perception of companies like Virgin and BA. So it's quite a difficult one to balance, but certainly taking in mind that the way an organisation responds to the pandemic, it does correlate with trust, and trust is fundamentally going to be an important driver for consumer choice, regardless of the category, as is the extent to which a company cares for their employees or is seen to be proactive at supporting and creating a safe working environment for people who work for them. And that's been really interesting. It rates at the moment about 66% in terms of being a driver of choice in a category, compared to being that it's a great British brand. So in terms of comms, that message around safety and care is going to be really important in comparison to what was, we're a British organisation or made in the UK, which has been, over the last 12 months, been something that's been leveraged quite a bit given what's happened politically in the UK for the last 18 months. So those drivers of decisions are certainly going to shift over time.
Yeah, and I think, as an organisation, we've housed 30 doctors and nurses. It was amazing, actually. They did a thing on BBC News about Royal London Hospital, and we have a building very close to there, and we had a lot of doctors and nurses from that particular hospital. And I think it's something that has been really important for us, and we've actually managed to get care boxes from other partners of ours, from America, sending stuff over for these doctors and nurses. And I felt it was just important for us to do. And I think the hospitality industry has done a lot of wonderful things, whether it's food or accommodation, and I think that does build trust. We've had staff who've had to work through this. We had probably a couple of hundred either students or corporates staying with us, so people have been on call. And I think one of the things that you mentioned there is in terms of trust with staff. There's been a lot of focus around customers' sentiment and not probably enough in terms of staff sentiment. And I've talked with the Digital Home to a number of hotels, and some people are, well, we're probably going to open mid-July. We're going to start talking to staff at the end of June because that relates to furlough. With our business, we potentially might have students coming in September, and we are doing a lot of things around that at the moment. And so we have started anonymous questionnaires of our team to see if they feel comfortable coming to the office. We're based in Holborn, centre London. Most people will have to commute at least an hour. Fortunately, I live a little closer, about 10 kilometres from work. I've tried to run in. I practiced this morning, so I can get to work in 45 to 50 minutes, which is good. But I cannot definitely do that every day. But it was very interesting to hear those results. And I think it's really important for the hotels to start reaching out to their staff as soon as possible, because that will be part of this whole trust building, even to consumers, because ultimately hotels are nothing without people. All accommodation providers are the same. Without the guests and without the staff, it's a match, whether it's restaurants or pubs or whatever. And fortunately, before lockdown, we had a lot of procedures in place, and a lot of the staff remembered that. We had hand sanitizer everywhere. We had PPE for our housekeepers already. So some of it was there, but there's been an extension, and there's a cocooning issue where people are very comfortable, as you said, very content in their little bubble. One of the questions I did raise with someone was, would you feel comfortable going sitting on a sunny day like today in a beer garden with all your friends? Oh yes, but not coming on the tube. Oh no. Okay, well that's still a crowded space, but that is probably in the short term the new norm. People, as your study shows, friends and family are way more of a priority than getting on the tube. My wife actually went to work yesterday. She came back and she was on the Thames at 6 o'clock, and it was immaculate, and there was the social distance spacing and everything else. A bit bizarre to see, and normally 6 o'clock. St Pancras is pretty busy. So I think it's important, particularly for city centre hotels, because I think they probably don't have parking. Staff probably can't afford to drive in because of congestion charge now. It's all well saying, we're going to open on the 5th of July, but will you actually have staff members who are comfortable working there? And, or, will you have to maybe have a floor for staff to stay over so they can, or shifts may have to change. The other thing is the traditional check-in time at 3 o'clock. There's been a move to change that at 3 o'clock. I think someone was telling me once, it was in a pub, so it may not be true, that it was to do with people getting off the road with the horse and carts when the hotels first started having people that they got off the road at 3 o'clock to check into their inn. If that's true, it's a great story. If not, then I apologise. It's not my fault. But that might have to change. So you might have to have staggered check-ins. And 9 to 5 won't exist. in reality. And the mayor and previous mayors have been trying to change that for years, because obviously that surge of people all working at the same time doesn't really make sense. And also flexible working. Maybe people can work 3 days a week from home and 2 days a week in the office. It's difficult where in a hotel, majority of the staff will be front of house needing to work all the time, and then they'll see their colleagues who are able to work from home 3 days a week. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of building that trust with staff and therefore sharing it with customers, so everyone's all in it together. And I think these stats show that there's great anxiety in all sorts of ways, but it's very different depending on where your property is located.
Yeah, it's a great segue, because it brings us on to this. This is another data point which I think is important to look at as well. So we asked people where they'd be willing to stay, and I think that correlates quite nicely with what you're talking about there, that people are more inclined at the moment to stay in areas that may be a little bit more remote, maybe less likely to be in city centre locations. So we've got there, you can see seaside and rural outperform town and city centre destination, which I think I'll jump on to the next slide, because I think this is connected to what we've been talking about. So yeah, places where we can feel a little bit safer with distance from others. But in terms of how people get there, if you look at the UK now and ask, what mode of transport do you feel most comfortable with? It's an interesting pattern to see, where people are saying walking, taking the car, going by bicycle are the modes of transport where they feel most comfortable at the moment. But on the other end of the scale, if you look over here on the right-hand side, you've got tube and aeroplane. So tube, those, in London or in Manchester, we got the trams, where things can be a little bit more compact in certain modes of transport. The people at the moment seem to be perceived as being risky to travel by at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think obviously that I've done some work with the Tourism Alliance on the board, and been listening to concern about quarantine and how that 40-day quarantine will impact particularly London, but all city centres where you get international tourists. Obviously, there's the quarantine part, and there's also the fear of people getting on the plane in the first place. One of the things that I remember was when 9/11 happened, the month afterwards, 10th of October, I actually had to go to New York. My cousin was getting married in New York, and I flew, and it was a bit weird. People were telling me to I couldn't take my bottle of water with me. I had to take my shoes off. They really looked through my bags, and the whole security thing took 10 times as long as probably had done previously. But after about 6 months, people just got used to it, and I think that's probably what's going to happen with this. I mean, the cruise thing is quite. I mean, the cruise industry has had ups and downs in the past, but it's had a really unfortunate press. There was one boat, I think, that was stuck for about 3.5 weeks off land until they knew what they were going to do with this boat. So I think all of it, and then the tube is the tube, and I think I for one don't particularly like going on the tube this time of year, particularly in a suit, because although it's good for weight loss, it's not good for personal hygiene. I think it will change. I mean, obviously, the cycle revolution on our question over the south was cycle to work scheme. Reminded a few people that we actually had it a few years ago, and not many people actually signed up to it. Not with the current organisation, but another one with Uber Digital. But yeah, that could be a great thing for just general health and well-being in the UK. But I think this shows it's an issue, because if you can't get your team to the office, to the hotel, to the restaurant or pub, it's going to be a challenge to operate under normal circumstances, as it were. But yeah, I think I'm sure in 4 weeks' time, the views may be quite different depending on what happens. I think obviously the opening, and you obviously work across retail, and talked about it yesterday, was the reopening of shops and shopping centres and large stores could be a bit of a trust test for consumers, which will help hotels and restaurants, because in theory they're more public, more enclosed than a lot of hotels. But this also shows that hoteliers now considering when to open, depending on the clarity on the furlough scheme and how that's going to work on a part-time basis, they may extend it later in July or August or September if they're a city centre hotel, but be more keen to open if they're a rural or coastal hotel for the 4th of July, and how that will play out. Because I think you look at these stats and you feel a little, I would feel a little uncomfortable in terms of opening straight away, unless I'd really engage with the staff. But I think the reality is, as people see other people move around, this herd mentality, not herd immunity, is very careful, is what people will follow. And it's like people following baking banana bread or sourdough. It's because other people are doing it. I think as confidence grows, things will change.
Yeah, we've seen it in other categories. It's been quite interesting to look at, broadly across the spectrum. Is off the top of my head, I think it's 20% of the UK exercise a new skill at least 3 times a week. You've got this whole new group of people out there who use this lockdown as a way of learning new things, getting new skills, and it's no surprise that cycling as a means of transport has become more popular. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. I've got friends who go on cycling holidays across Europe, and you can kind of imagine a scenario now where they might say, well, given that we're not so comfortable, flying there, why don't we get the boat or we find another means of getting there and try and cycle as far as we can, partly because, the love of the sport. Also, there could be dimensions there where they're not so comfortable traveling using too much public transport. It's going to be...
I've done a couple of cycle rides and unfortunately had to wear light wear for them. They were 100 miles. I don't own a bike, partly because my wife thinks I'm far too clumsy to be trusted cycling through the traffic of central London. But I have, again, a lot of friends who are big cycle aficionados, and yeah, they're quite excited about potentially hotels being more accessible to cyclists. Having the air pump station, having potentially beers served outside, beer gardens. A lot of people will do that. Not encouraging drink driving, but will go and have a beer and then have a bite to eat. But there is some places that just don't accept cyclists. So maybe that's a new opportunity for rural and coastal hotels to actually cycle accepted and enhance that. And as things progress, that may be a European-wide thing where Europeans will come over and want to actually have cycle holidays more here, as long as hotels are accepting of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think, and particularly within all the data we've seen, there is not a kind of one consistent rule across everything we've seen. There's I think the successful companies are going to recognise that there are these kind of smaller opportunities, smaller trends, but potentially bigger opportunities to take advantage of. We were quite interested to see how you all felt on the call, actually, about how you're feeling with yourselves about attending different destinations over this period. So we have a question. Which of the following destinations would you feel comfortable taking your family to right now? By the way, little tip, if any of you have maximised it in your screen, you might find that some of these buttons don't work. So if you minimise the poll on your screen, you might be able to avoid that. So if you want to give it a vote, then we'll have a little look at the results.
Need to do the countdown clock.
Yeah, did it. Boom.
There we
go. Right. Can you see these results as well, Ben, or do you need me to read them to you?
I think if you just press share, I think everyone should be able to see them.
If I close the poll and share results. There we go.
There we go. Brilliant. Look at that. So 43%. Thanks for voting, everybody. Yeah, so we've got 12% saying pub, 16% saying restaurant, 29% saying visitor attraction, 43% saying hotel. So the results would suggest either, you know, we've got a group of people who aren't particularly comfortable, you know, taking their family to these particular locations, or they haven't voted in the poll. And what's your take on this, Steve?
I thought because of the accessibility of a pub or restaurant, potentially, you know, with beer gardens or outside eating, that people would want to do that. But it shows potentially this slight restlessness, and although being content, you know, I don't have children, but have friends who are working full time and homeschooling, have found it pretty tough. So obviously going to a hotel now might be great, and obviously we've got hoteliers on here, so I guess they trust each other to do the right thing for both customers and staff and team members. So it's not quite what I expected. I actually thought visitor attractions, very much country park, else would be number one, but I guess that's a positive thing. It'd be interesting to see, and I don't know how you could weave it into something like this in terms of one of your customer sentiment, consumer sentiment data, in terms of whether people feel comfortable in any of these or none of the above, because I think that may guide the industry in terms of what to open and when. Yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we can close that down, Jane, and I can show what consumers said. There you go. Yeah, so if you ask, I think the patterns actually do reflect to some extent what consumers are telling us. You might have clocked it early on the slide at the front, or we asked people what they're looking forward to. 5% of people said they're looking forward to going back to the pub. You know, you can't really keep some British people away from this stuff. But when you ask consumers, you know, we ask them to imagine a scenario where it was safe to return, the guidance given by the government was allowing them to do so. And we asked them, you know, if one of these places was open and had the right precautions in place, would you be willing to dine in a restaurant, stay in a hotel, or be willing to go to a pub? And it's interesting because the data does, in some respects, reflect the poll there. We're seeing overall that people at the moment are more likely to say they would dine in a restaurant or visit a hotel compared to going to a pub. And now, one hypothesis, you know, I've got on this at the moment is just to do with control of safety. Obviously, in you know, in hotels, it's probably a little bit more, you could argue, in terms of social contact, perhaps sometimes a bit more of a linear journey compared to if you go to a pub, a couple of pints in, you can be talking to anybody, and the movement in that space is often a little bit more kind of chaotic, and I mean that in the sense of, in terms of how people move and engage in the space. Which brings us on to quite, I think, quite an interesting point. This is one that Jane and Steve were discussing when we thought about creating some bespoke questions for the session today. Was, well, what distance do people think is acceptable in a restaurant? And I was fascinated by this to sort of see. Obviously, in the UK, the guidelines are 2 meters. The WHO have said, well, 1 meter distance is suffice. And in terms of this, I think reflects not just you know, not just people's interpretation of the message, but also where they're getting their information from with regard to you know, how to exercise precaution and safety. So you've got 44% of people in the UK who are telling us that actually 2 meters distance from someone they don't know in a restaurant is an acceptable distance away from them. And then it's a really interesting pattern in the data where you've got 14% of people saying that actually, no, sorry, 28% of people saying that they would feel comfortable in a space that's less than 2 meters, and exactly the same proportion of people saying they want more than 2 meter space. So it does reflect to some extent the levels of anxiety and stress we're seeing in the UK at the moment. It is split. It's not a uniform pattern that everybody's feeling worried. There's much more nuance to that. And when you look at, we ask people why, why did you choose the option you've given us? And it's fascinating to see that some people just trust the government's advice implicitly. If the government had told me that's safe, it's safe. I don't care. That's fine. You've got others saying, well, to be honest, I'm feeling a bit frustrated with all this. I think this is a load of nonsense. I think less than 2 meters is perfectly acceptable. You've got other people who've recognised that they've recognised the WHO guidelines and referenced that as their reason for feeling they can stay closer. Now, for those that are saying we want more than 2 meters distance, much more likely to be characterised, we've seen the data, by people who currently feel worried and at the moment have families. So I think when, depending on the type of customer you get in to the space, then, or your typical type of audience that you serve, it's worthwhile just considering this with how you operationally set things up. I appreciate it's a very difficult thing to do, but creating kind of family zones or things like this might be something that proves to be effective, in line with the customer's expectations and safety rules at the moment. Have you got any thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, well, obviously we discussed about trust in government and how that may change when you do this survey. Obviously in Spain and Germany, I can't remember exactly which countries, a lot of them are operating between 1 and 1.5 meters. I've seen a lot of articles around from a scientific perspective where 1 meter is fine, and obviously for the restaurant and pub space, 2 meters is probably not feasible to open with unless you've got outside space. But yeah, it's, again, goes back to the trust side. It's, what information will people trust? And if we do change that now, what reaction people will have to it, because they'll say, well, why didn't we have this all along? But I do think they will change that over the next few weeks.
Yeah. So in terms of the kind of key metrics, they were the ones that we wanted to really share with you all. I think in terms of the patterns we're seeing, if I was to give you a perspective looking across different sectors, I think this is an industry that has been really good at being proactive and being thoughtful and empathetic towards the current situation. We can see that in data that we've got. In terms of the UK market, this is also a sector where there is people are looking forward to engaging with it. We're not seeing the same pattern in other things, such as retail. The only other sector where we're seeing strong performance really is in DIY and home management. Is people spending time at home, improving their living spaces. But it's also been a really great time for lots of people who've been lucky enough to spend a bit more time, reflecting on what's important to them. And that's why I think we're seeing a high degree to which people are saying that family is the most important aspect to them. That's where they feel their sense of community at the moment. And all these things are, I think are vitally important long term, particularly, in the hospitality sector, in terms of the types of holidays that people might want to take in the short term. If they haven't been able to see their families for a while, that might be a reason to engage, and being able to kind of create space. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens in retail when it opens. Speaking to some of our retail clients, there's a real high level of nervousness, because what's happened in supermarkets since they've been open is that they were the first line of kind of engagement for lots of people, because that's where you go get your essentials from each week. Perception of the supermarkets has dwindled week in, week out, because people are feeling frustrated with the experience they've created. So if there's anything to do at the moment, I think learning from some of the other sectors have and tried to improve would be a really good place to start as well. Grant, I think that was most of the data we wanted to show for today.
Great. Can I dive in with some questions and comments from the audience then? This one made me laugh. On the most recent slide, what distance would be acceptable? David Darvish has commented that 1 meter would have been too much for him, too close for him pre-COVID, let alone post-COVID, which possibly applies to many. On the survey, Eric Rogers, and we were aware of this, he said, doesn't the audience impact the answer to this question? And that was very much the point. We wanted to see how the hospitality industry was supporting the hospitality industry, whereas Ben's figures are much a wider range. So it does affect the impact. So wishful thinking, but it's nice to see that our audience is nice and supporting our own industry, which is good. Sam from Certify suggested that perhaps we should have had none as an option on that survey. So a bit late now, but yes, perhaps that would have been an option. So, gosh, I'm going to rattle through these because we're into our last quarter of an hour. Jill Whittaker has said that she lives at the seaside and the beaches are crowded and people are gathering in big groups, and there's no discernible lockdown that she can see. Do you think this is a trend or isolated instances?
Interesting. Well, if I can comment from consumer data, this is based on what we're seeing with people's sort of travel habits. I think this is something that's going to stay for a while. So there's quite a high degree of people are saying they, the notion of a staycation. That's where they. How do I phrase this? I believe that's still going to continue, and I think looking at claimed levels of spend into the future with travel, we've seen that it's remained relatively steady. If anything, there's been a slight decline in the extent to which people think they will spend money in the sector, which we'll see how this goes over the next few weeks. But I think it's reflecting on the fact that people are actually saying this year our holiday is going to be in the UK. There's quite a large cohort of people who are now not considering traveling internationally for the foreseeable future.
I also think we've got lockdown fatigue. So I'm fortunate I've got a small garden and live near a small park. So I've had access to outside space. For those who have not, getting down to the beach, it's very difficult to police. You can't ask the whole community, are you going down to the beach? It's thousands of people who have probably been dreaming of it for 10, 11 weeks. There is also the reality that the numbers are a lot lower, and therefore people of certain ages, and if you look at the demographics of people who were on the beach, it was probably more a younger demographic than an older demographic, feel not necessarily invincible because they can still get ill from it, but the stats will show that they're probably less likely to die from it. And that is a terrible thing to talk about, but that's people's personal belief of risk. And although that extends to everyone, it's a very difficult conversation to have, but actually it's something that people are thinking, well, I might get it, but not the end of the world. I'll have to isolate for 40 days because I'm on furlough anyway. Do you see what I mean? So I think it's a, anything to do with death or health is a very difficult thing to talk about, but people's views of where it is will be different.
I think that's a really interesting point, and we're encouraging this with lots of companies where previously they've just been looking at data demographically. So when you ask people to describe your target audience, often people say they're this age, of this gender, they're from here, they do X. What needs to change in every business is to talk about risk profile, level of confidence, and their attitudes. And we need to surface that data more in terms of how we profile people.
And that will feed into your marketing plan. And again, if you've got, it'll be about your facilities and when you open them. And if you traditionally had an older demographic and you shifted to a younger demographic, what do you have to do for your marketing to do that? And then what risks can you put in or not for both staff and customers?
Okay, Ben, these two very similar questions actually. One from Chris Denison Smith, who on your slide that was entitled "What type of accommodation would they prefer?" He would be interested to know what the usual percentage of people who stayed in hotels was like, and is it predicted to go up and down? Although he says 39% looks like a high proportion, is that higher than normal? And Daniel Buck asks pretty much the same. You've shown views on destinations and willingness to travel abroad or not right now, but how has this changed since pre-COVID?
Yeah, I can. There are questions I can address afterwards. So I can pull those stats out.
Okay, all right. No, that's brilliant. Julian T is asking, the risk of a second wave of infection is real once the lockdown is lifted. How do you believe the stats reported today would read in a second spike hit?
Yeah.
Great
question.
Yeah,
after you, Steve.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I've decided not to watch the news as much as I did the first week. I was in America and first week of March for work, and with a lot of students who wanted to come this summer, and knowing that the impending doom that when I got on the plane, when I got back, I'd had to deal with. And I had terrible anxiety I've never had it before, 4 or 5. I thought I was having a heart problem, but that's what anxiety feels like. And it was because I was watching the news the whole time.
Mm.
And I think that's not helped. I think the reality is that every single country in the world doesn't want a second wave. And I saw an article that popped up on my phone. South Korea, huge spike since lockdown. They had 40 new cases, 40, after 2.3 million students went back to school. That's actually pretty good, yeah.
Mm.
But a lot of people will read the headlines. The reality is we do not know. I think for the hospitality industry, it would be a killer. I think for the British economy, it would be a killer. But it would be the same for the whole of the world. Going back to risk, I read a very interesting article in the New York Times that humans decide when pandemics are over, not scientists, consumers, because people will have their own perceived level of risk of, actually, I'm under 40, the chances are I'm going to be okay. If I get sick, I'll have a test, I'll isolate for 14 days, and then I move on.
Mm.
That matter of factness will potentially happen at some point. And it's a bit like the fear of traveling after 9/11, and it's mad cow disease and various things that have happened. This is way bigger and way more scary. And, I've had friends who've had it and they didn't have to go to hospital, but also have dealt with doctors and nurses who are off their feet, tired. But there is a point where the risk profile for you personally changes. And human nature is we're explorers and we're adventurers, and we've lived through things before without the science and technology that we have to try and help us through it. And I think that will happen. But it's obviously a fear, and a justified fear, and completely rational. And people's human nature will take over as to when those chances are. But obviously technology is trying to isolate things into small areas, whether it's schools or locations or whatever, this track and trace thing, to ensure that if there's little spikes that they can be controlled. There are theories that the actual virus is, the virulent part of it is dying down a bit, but again, no one can prove it.
Yeah, just following on from that, there's quite an interesting change we've seen in people's sense of community. So the first month of the pandemic, you saw a high degree of people saying they feel a strong sense of community with their friends, their local area, and with people around the world. We have seen all of those measures die off over the last few weeks slightly. So it's been about 2 to 3% drop on each of those points. So just picking up on your point about, people will exercise individual choice and will decide when the pandemic's over. And I think the events of the weekend will certainly exacerbate that type of message. So to predict what might happen if we had a second spike is it's really challenging, because there's often, you can kind of forecast things based on having a sort of a set of parameters you can kind of control on the data to work out whether you're going to see this again in being able to kind of use an econometrics model. However, given that the messages that we've been received by the government are changing and not necessarily consistent, that has a huge impact on how people respond. So predicting it is very difficult. Sorry, that's not a straightforward answer.
Okay, this is one after my own heart. We've been doing having a lot of discussions internally about our annual conference, but we're getting great support from the Royal Lancaster, who's come up with some brilliant initiatives. So we're hoping to maybe balance a virtual conference with our real conference. But this question from Jan Kolovecki: do you have any indication or data on how people will be willing to meet each other on business meetings? He's suggesting a one-to-one. And do you believe the trend will go to much more digital?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've had a few companies come to us about how B2B is going to engage and how decisions are going to be made as well. I'm not seeing any evidence at the moment from anyone that we deal with or we speak to, and I'm going to talk about this more anecdotally, where people are, really, if you've got an office-based job where they're really excited about going back into office and to do kind of face-to-face meetings. We're not tracking that in the business community at the moment, partly because it's a bit more complicated than doing kind of consumer tracker. But in terms of what we've seen across different sectors, that people aren't necessarily rushing out to be face to face at the moment. But I can only talk about it in terms of professional services. Really.
I tend not to sit at my desk all day. Normally out and about having a meeting. I have started speaking to people with this new building. Oh, do you want to come down and see it? Oh yeah, actually I'd love to. And I think it's actually enabled people starting to want to do it. I think people are going to make sure that the meeting is relevant. I think we'll really focus on it would be much easier to do this face to face, and Zoom's been great and stuff like this is great. The fact is, it's way more complicated, Jane passing questions to us than us seeing people's faces and seeing, particularly with stats, you look at, when you see someone's face, you go, oh, okay, they didn't respond to that. You can't do that here. So again, we're not robots yet, and I think it'll take a while. I do think flexible working, and even in training and education, blended learning, a combination of in-person and online will probably be the definite short-term trend. But if you look at the stats done on international students, they'd rather not come if it's all online. And that's because they want to meet other people.
Yeah.
That's part of the experience. And we're still, prior to all of this, people were talking about the importance of experience. And I think being locked in and restricted on what you can and can't do will only enhance people's requirements to have unique experiences, human interaction, and not feel so isolated. But they will choose those moments very carefully, particularly in the short term.
Great. I know one of the most successful meeting I think I've had online was actually our board meeting, where there were 12 board members, and we all know each other very well, obviously, and that actually worked incredibly well because they're all very busy people, and we had 2 hours out of their day, but not have any travel time, not have any wasted time, and we had a lot of important things to discuss, so it worked exceptionally well. Right, I've got one last question here from Simon Grex. Should hotels offer their facilities, bars and restaurants, solely to residents to minimise people roaming? Would this help build more trust? I guess that's one for you, Steve, more than Ben, although feel free, Ben. We've got 2 minutes left.
I think whether it's marketing, operational, training, your plans will need to be reviewed and changed every week, because people will change and you'll only know once people are in your restaurant. In terms of working out if your operational side works well, doing residents only to start with is a really good way of having the test case. Financially, that might not be viable. So it's going to be very different depending on how a hotel operates if their wet and dry sales in their restaurants are based on visitors to it or residents. But I think it's just very important to monitor and tweak and change, and maybe initially marketing to residents only, and then it's 50 miles, and then it's 100 miles, and then you then start working that all out. Maybe it's more takeaways or deliveries. I came some other crazy idea that I'm gonna run past a hotelier soon for our apartments. But yeah, I think you just have to do it. And I think where you would have a normal 2 or 3 year plan or a season plan for the summer, everything has to be tweaked and changed as you go along, because things, and you can see with this consumer research, people are changing all the time depending on what's happening around them.
Yeah. And I would encourage certainly just listening. So it's I think when doing those tweaks and changes, just constantly be asking to customers and staff how they're feeling about it, whether what's their view on it, and make sure you've got the metrics in place.
Brilliant. Okay, well that brings us pretty much to the end of our time. So thank you all very much for listening. And just as a reminder that the data and opinions expressed today opinions are exactly that and should be treated as very current and opinions only. If you need formal advice or specific research completed on your behalf, then please come to HOSPA for an appropriate introduction to Ben or and other professional advisors. Big thank you to Ben and Steve for all their wise words today. Please do visit the HOSPA website to see our crisis support page and also the positive news pages that we are posting during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can also find recordings of these webinars with a summary of the key points. This one should be uploaded within 24 hours or so. Details of the next webinar, which are our regular feature on a Wednesday morning at 10 a.m, are listed in the events section. Thank you for listening. We look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully in the not too distant future. But that's goodbye from me, and goodbye from Ben and Steve too. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening. Goodbye.